It was supposed to be just another Saturday night in the Bronx, a regular evening spent like any other. Mark, Sarah, and Jake had only just moved to the city a few weeks ago. They were fresh faces in a place that felt both new and familiar at the same time. The hustle and bustle of the Bronx were a far cry from the quiet suburbs they had grown up in. But the energy was infectious. The city had a way of making you feel alive. Even when everything around you was chaotic and fast-paced, they had already started to settle in, finding their favorite spots to eat, getting to know the streets, and familiarizing themselves with the subway routes. But there was one thing that had become a constant companion: the rumors. Everyone they met seemed to have a story about the Bronx. Most were harmless, just a little exaggerated for the sake of a good laugh. But there were others that were harder to shake off, the kind that made you pause and look over your shoulder when walking home at night. Whispers about strange happenings, inexplicable noises, and eerie lights flickering in the dark corners of the borough. People spoke of things lurking in the shadows, creatures seen only in the corner of your eye, and forgotten tunnels deep beneath the streets that held secrets no one was brave enough to uncover. The kind of stories that were easy to dismiss as urban legends, or maybe just the product of too many late nights and too much alcohol. But the more they heard, the more unsettling it all became. Mark, Sarah, and Jake had brushed it all off as silly gossip, the kind of stuff you hear in every city. They weren't ones to let a little fear control their lives. The night they found themselves wandering the streets of the Bronx, it was supposed to be another one of those carefree adventures. No real plans, just three friends exploring their new home. But tonight, something was different. The usual noise of the city was quieter than it had been before. It wasn't the usual hum of traffic or the distant chatter of people. It was almost like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. The streets felt oddly deserted for a Saturday night, and the chill that settled in the air seemed heavier than it should have been. They had ended up in a part of the Bronx they hadn't visited before. The older, less populated sections of the borough, where the buildings were older and more dilapidated. It wasn't that the place was abandoned, far from it, but it had an aura of neglect, like it had been forgotten by time itself. As they walked down the narrow streets, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the silence, although that was part of it. It was more like the city itself had changed in some way, as if they had crossed some invisible line. The air tasted different, thick with a dampness that made the back of his neck itch, the kind of feeling that makes you second-guess your every step. "I think we should turn back," Sarah said, her voice uncharacteristically soft as she glanced around. "This doesn't feel right." Jake, always the adventurous one, laughed it off. "Oh, come on, Sarah. It's just the Bronx. A little weirdness never hurt anyone. Let's just see where this leads. Maybe we'll find something cool." Mark didn't say anything, but he was starting to feel the same unease that Sarah had. He wanted to trust Jake, wanted to believe that it was just a bit of nervous energy. But the street was starting to look more and more like something out of a horror movie. The streetlights flickered intermittently, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out unnaturally. The old buildings that lined the alleyway were covered in graffiti, some of it looking fresh, others faded and forgotten. They were surrounded by signs of decay, the kind of places that felt like they were only a breath away from collapsing in on themselves. "Let's just check it out," Jake said with a grin, trying to keep the mood light. But there was something in his eyes that suggested he wasn't as carefree as he was letting on. Mark caught a glimpse of it, a flash of something that could only be described as curiosity mixed with unease. But Jake wasn't one to back down from anything, and his words seemed to pull the group forward. So they continued, walking deeper into the alley, each step taking them further away from the places they knew and closer to whatever was waiting at the end of this path. They didn't know how long they had been walking when they finally reached the end of the alley. It was blocked by a large rusted gate, the kind you'd expect to find in an abandoned lot or a forgotten corner of the city. The gate was half open, as if it had been left that way intentionally, inviting anyone curious enough to step through. Beyond it, the alley continued into the darkness, where the faint glow of distant streetlights could barely reach. Mark stopped in his tracks. Something about this felt wrong, like they had stumbled into a place where they weren't meant to be. "I don't think we should go any further," he said, his voice lower than usual. His instinct was screaming at him to turn back, but Jake's enthusiasm was infectious. "Relax, dude," Jake said, his grin widening as he pushed the gate open further. "It's just an old alley. Who knows? We might find something cool, like a hidden cafe or a cool spot we can hang out." Mark hesitated for a moment longer, but then Sarah grabbed his arm. "Come on, it's just a little further. What's the worst that could happen?" she said, trying to push back her own nerves. The truth was, they all felt it. The unease that seemed to wrap around them like a thick fog. But none of them said it aloud. No one wanted to be the first to back out. The gate creaked loudly as they pushed it open, and the sound echoed down the alley. As they stepped through, they found themselves in a part of the city they hadn't seen before. The street was empty. No cars, no people, just a dark, quiet stretch of road that seemed to have been forgotten by time. The buildings on either side of them were old, some of them abandoned, others with boarded-up windows. The atmosphere felt suffocating, as if the air itself was thick with history, with secrets that had long been buried. The further they walked, the more they realized that they had entered a part of the Bronx that wasn't just forgotten. It was hidden. No one came here. No one knew about this place. It was like the city had swallowed it whole and then locked it away, never to be seen again. The eerie silence around them was broken only by the sound of their footsteps echoing against the pavement. Then, without warning, they all stopped at the same time. At the end of the street, hidden in the shadows, they saw something. It wasn't a person, but a figure, standing perfectly still in the darkness. It looked like it was waiting for them, as if it knew they were coming. "Jake," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Maybe we should go back." But Jake, who had been leading the way, stood frozen, his eyes locked onto the figure, and for a moment, Mark thought he was going to say something, anything to break the tension. But he didn't. He just stared. "Who's there?" Jake called out into the darkness, his voice echoing in the stillness. No answer, just silence. And then, as if the world itself had decided to hold its breath, the figure moved. Slowly, deliberately, it started walking toward them. Step by step, its figure coming into view, but with each step, it seemed to grow larger, more monstrous, more than just a figure. Mark's heart raced, and he felt a chill crawl down his spine. He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't move. Something about that figure held him in place, made him feel like there was no way out. As the figure stepped into the faint light of the street, they could finally see it clearly. And what they saw was not human. The air grew colder, and the silence deepened, suffocating them. They had walked into something they could never escape, something that had been waiting for them, hidden in the shadows of the Bronx, and it wasn't going to let them leave. The deeper they ventured into the alley, the more the streets seemed to tighten around them. It was as if the city had begun to press in, swallowing them whole. The usual hum of traffic, the chatter of pedestrians, the faint sound of music from nearby apartments, all of it faded into an eerie stillness that settled around them like a thick fog. For the first time since they had arrived in the Bronx, Mark, Sarah, and Jake felt a sense of unease that none of them had expected. It was as if the city had transformed before their very eyes. They had walked through neighborhoods with their fair share of quirks and oddities, but this was different. The buildings here were older, more run down. The cracks in the pavement seemed deeper, as though the ground itself was slowly being consumed by the weight of the years. The dim glow from the few streetlights above cast long shadows that stretched out like fingers, trying to reach them. They had no idea what was waiting for them, but something told them they should turn back. Mark glanced at Sarah and Jake, who were walking ahead of him. He could feel the hair on the back of his neck standing up. The air was unusually cold, much colder than it should have been for a mild evening in the Bronx. He tugged at his jacket, hoping to ward off the creeping chill, but it didn't help. Something about this place didn't sit right with him. He wished they had turned around earlier, but Jake seemed intent on pushing forward. "Do you hear that?" Sarah's voice broke through the silence, her whisper barely audible, but carrying a note of anxiety. Mark and Jake stopped immediately, their footsteps halting in the cold air. The three of them stood in the middle of the alley, straining to hear what Sarah had noticed. At first, Mark thought it was just the wind, but then he heard it too. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but there was no mistaking it. A low, rhythmic sound, like a chant. It wasn't the kind of sound you'd expect to hear in the middle of the Bronx. Not the usual music or noise that echoed from the streets. No, this was different. It had a strange, unsettling quality to it, as if it was coming from somewhere deep underground or from behind a wall. Sarah looked at Mark, her face pale. "What is that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jake, who had been the most fearless of the three, let out a small laugh, though it sounded forced. "It's probably just a bunch of people partying or something," he said, trying to dismiss the tension in the air. But Mark could see the doubt in Jake's eyes. Even he wasn't as certain as he wanted to appear. They stood for a moment, listening. The chant was getting louder now, clearer. The words, indecipherable, but filled with a strange, rhythmic cadence that felt almost hypnotic. Mark felt a shiver run down his spine. It wasn't music. It wasn't even a voice. It was something else entirely. Something ancient, primal, and unsettling. The alley stretched out before them, its darkness seeming to deepen the further they looked. The buildings loomed over them like silent sentinels, their windows empty and staring. And then, as if drawn by the strange sound, they found themselves walking again, moving toward the source of the noise. The air felt thicker now, and every step they took felt heavier. The sound of their feet on the pavement was muffled, swallowed by the oppressive silence around them. They turned a corner, and there, standing before them, was an old, abandoned building. It was unlike any of the others around it. Dilapidated, worn down, but somehow still standing, as though time had forgotten it. The windows were boarded up, the once white facade now covered in layers of dirt and grime. The door, which looked as though it hadn't been opened in decades, stood ajar, creaking slightly as the wind pushed it back and forth. Mark's heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was where the chanting was coming from. "Come on, it's just an old building," Jake said, his voice much more hesitant now. He gave a nervous chuckle, trying to sound confident, but Mark could see through the bravado. Jake wasn't as sure of this place as he wanted to appear. "There's nothing to be afraid of," he added, but his words sounded hollow, like he was trying to convince himself as much as the others. Sarah looked up at the building, her face reflecting the same unease Mark felt. "I don't know, guys. This feels wrong. We should turn back." But before anyone could respond, Jake was already walking toward the door, his curiosity outweighing the caution that had suddenly taken hold of him. "Come on," he urged, looking back over his shoulder. "Just a quick look. What's the worst that could happen?" Reluctantly, Mark and Sarah followed him, though neither of them felt good about it. They passed through the door, which groaned as it swung open, revealing the darkness within. The air inside the building was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew hung heavy in the air. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and broken furniture lay scattered about, forgotten by time. But it wasn't the decrepit condition of the building that unsettled them. The deeper they went into the building, the colder it became. Mark pulled his jacket tighter around himself, but it didn't help. The cold was oppressive, like it had seeped into the very walls of the place. It was a cold that didn't feel natural. The temperature wasn't just dropping, it was sinking, settling into their bones. They reached a hallway, and as they moved down it, the chanting seemed to grow louder. It felt as though it was coming from all around them, from every corner of the building. The walls seemed to close in, narrowing the hallway until it felt like they were walking through a tunnel, a passage that led to something they couldn't yet comprehend. At the end of the hall, they saw a door. It was slightly ajar, and through the crack, they could see a faint glow, an eerie, unnatural light that flickered in time with the chant. Without a word, they approached the door, each of them. Jake reached out and pushed the door open, and as it creaked on its hinges, the sound of chanting flooded their ears, overwhelming them. It was louder than before, almost deafening now. Mark's heart raced in his chest, and Sarah's hand gripped his arm tightly, as if she needed something solid to hold on to. Inside the room, they saw something that froze them in their tracks. A group of people, figures cloaked in dark robes, stood in a circle around an altar. The chanting was coming from them, their voices rising and falling in unison, as though they were part of something larger, something ancient. The altar was stone, worn with age, and on it lay strange objects, candles, symbols, and items Mark couldn't quite make out, but he knew instinctively they were not meant for ordinary eyes. The air in the room was thick with a heavy energy, a presence that seemed to fill the space. The figures didn't acknowledge the newcomers. They didn't need to. They were focused on something else, something far more important than the three intruders standing in the doorway. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he realized they had just stumbled upon something that was never meant to be found, something that had been hidden from the world for a reason. The chanting filled the air, vibrating in his chest, and he felt an unshakable sense of dread settle over him. They had walked into something that was far beyond their understanding, and now they were trapped. They followed the eerie chanting, feeling the strange pull guiding them deeper into the building. The air grew thicker, the darkness more intense, and Mark, Sarah, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking further into something they couldn't comprehend. Each step seemed to take them further away from reality and closer to something they couldn't escape. The chanting, a low hum, continued to reverberate in their bones, as if it was vibrating the very air around them. They had entered a place they shouldn't have, one that had been hidden for reasons they could never understand. At the end of the hallway, there was a dusty staircase leading downward into the blackness. The stairs creaked underfoot as they cautiously approached, their hearts pounding in their chests. The whole building seemed to breathe with them, the walls and the floor seeming to close in around them. The staircase was narrow, and the wooden steps had clearly been untouched for years, the wood groaning with every shift of their weight. The door at the bottom of the stairs was old, rusted, and barely hanging on its hinges. It looked as though it hadn't been opened in decades, and yet the moment they reached the top of the stairs, it creaked and groaned, slowly beginning to open by itself. Mark froze, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had seen a lot of strange things in his life, but this was something else. He exchanged a nervous glance with Sarah and Jake, but neither of them seemed to have the strength to say anything. The door opened just enough for them to see the dark basement below. The light from above barely reached the bottom, casting long, twisted shadows that stretched across the floor. It was like the entire basement was waiting for them. A feeling of dread began to settle over them as they realized they had no choice but to proceed. It wasn't as if they were being forced. They could have left at any time, but the sound, the chanting, the sensation of something calling to them made it impossible to turn around. "Let's go back," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. It was the first time any of them had spoken since entering the building. She wasn't sure if she wanted to turn back out of fear or curiosity, but something inside her urged her to leave. Jake, as usual, was the one to break the silence. "We've come this far," he said, though his voice was shakier than usual. "We have to see what this is. What's the worst that could happen?" Mark didn't respond, but he didn't have to. The words hung in the air, unanswered. He didn't know if Jake was trying to convince them or himself, but it didn't matter. Something was pulling them forward, and they couldn't resist it. The door swung open slowly, the hinges screeching as it revealed the basement below. It felt like time had stopped. The air smelled stale, musty with age. The dim light barely illuminated the stairs as they descended, but the farther down they went, the more the chanting grew. It was like it was coming from every direction, surrounding them, filling their ears, their heads, until it was all they could hear. They reached the bottom of the stairs, stepping into the cold darkness of the basement. It felt like they had entered a different world altogether. There was a strange energy in the air, like something ancient, something forgotten, was alive in this room. The walls of the basement were lined with stone, cold and unforgiving. The flickering light from the candles cast long shadows on the walls, creating an unsettling atmosphere that made their stomachs churn. As they stepped further into the room, their eyes began to adjust to the dim light. In the center of the basement, they saw a group of people standing in a circle. They were dressed in black robes, their faces hidden by hoods, and their hands raised toward the ceiling. The chanting seemed to come from them, their voices, low and melodic, reverberating in the room. Mark felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up as he watched them, his heart racing in his chest. They were surrounded by candles, their flames flickering as if they were alive, casting eerie shadows on the floor and walls. The room felt colder now, the chill seeping into their bones. Sarah shivered, wrapping her arms around herself, but it didn't help. The temperature seemed to drop with each passing moment. It wasn't just the cold air, it was something deeper, something unnatural. The chanting grew louder, more intense, as if the people in the circle were summoning something from the very depths of the earth. And then they saw it. In the center of the circle, there was a large stone symbol etched into the floor. Mark couldn't make out all of the details, but it didn't matter. There was something wrong about it, something that made his stomach turn. The symbol seemed to pulse with an energy all its own, its edges glowing faintly, as if it was alive. It was a design he had never seen before, a mixture of geometric shapes and curving lines that twisted in unnatural ways. He felt his breath catch in his throat as he stared at it, unable to tear his eyes away. Sarah grabbed Mark's arm, her grip tight and trembling. "We need to leave. Now." But they couldn't move. It was as if they were frozen in place, rooted to the floor by an invisible force. They watched, helpless, as the figures in the circle continued their chant, their voices rising higher and higher. The energy in the room was thickening, becoming oppressive. The candles flickered violently, casting long shadows across the room that seemed to stretch toward them. Something was happening, and they were in the middle of it. As the chanting reached a crescendo, the symbol in the center of the room began to glow brighter. The air was thick with the sensation of something dark and ancient being summoned into this world. Mark's heart raced, and he felt an overwhelming urge to run, to get out of there before whatever was happening tore them apart. But they couldn't move. It was as if they were being held in place, trapped by the energy in the room. The figures in the circle began to sway, their movements synchronized, their hands raised higher as if offering something to the glowing symbol. The chanting grew louder, more intense, filling the entire basement. Mark's ears began to ring with the sound, and the room seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the chant. And then, in an instant, it all stopped. The room went silent, the chanting ceasing as if it had never been. The symbol in the center of the room flickered, its glow dimming, but not before Mark saw something that would haunt him forever. A pair of eyes. They appeared in the center of the symbol, glowing in the darkness. At first, they were faint, mere flickers of light, but then they grew, becoming clearer, more defined. They were glowing with an unnatural, eerie light. Eyes that didn't belong to any human or any creature he had ever seen. They were eyes that seemed to look directly into his soul, eyes that saw everything and yet nothing at all. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he stared into them. He couldn't look away. It was as if the eyes were pulling him in, drawing him closer, holding him captive. He felt a chill deeper than anything he had ever known, something beyond the cold that filled the room. It was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made you feel as if your very existence was being erased. And then, just as suddenly as they appeared, the eyes blinked out of existence, vanishing into the dark, leaving the room in complete silence. The basement was still. Too still. The figures in the circle remained motionless, their heads bowed, their hands still raised in the air. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, an oppressive force that hung over them, heavier than anything they had ever felt before. Mark, Sarah, and Jake stood frozen, too afraid to move, too afraid to breathe. They had crossed a line. They had walked into something they weren't supposed to understand. And now, whatever had been summoned in that room was aware of them. And it wasn't done with them yet. Before any of them could react, the door to the basement slammed shut with a violent bang, the sound reverberating off the stone walls, rattling their bones. Mark, Sarah, and Jake froze, their hearts leaping into their throats. The immediate silence that followed was suffocating. Their minds struggled to comprehend the situation. They had stumbled into something they weren't supposed to see. And now they were trapped in this place with no way out. The cult members, still standing in their circle, had turned their heads toward the intruders, their faces hidden beneath the dark hoods of their robes. There was no expression, no anger, no surprise, just a cold, unblinking awareness. They didn't speak, not a word, but the air was thick with the weight of their gaze. "You've seen us," the figure said, his voice echoing in the cold room. "And now, you belong to us." The words were simple, but they hit with a brutal finality. It was as if the air around them had thickened and the ground beneath them had shifted. Mark's stomach churned, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. He looked at Sarah and Jake, but they were as frozen as he was, their faces pale with shock and fear. The realization settled in like a weight on his chest. They were no longer observers. They were part of something far darker than they could have ever imagined.
Panic surged within him, his breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, but there was nothing. The door behind them had slammed shut with a force they could not hope to overcome. There were no windows, no other doors. The walls were solid, the stone cold and unforgiving. They were trapped in this forsaken basement, surrounded by figures who had now turned their attention entirely upon them. "Please." Sarah's voice was a whisper, fragile and full of terror. "We didn't mean to." But the tall figure raised his hand, cutting her off with a sharp gesture. The silence that followed was deafening. It was as if he had shut off the very air around them. No one spoke, not the cult members, not even the chanting, which had seemed so loud just moments before. It was as though the whole world had gone still, holding its breath, waiting for what came next.
Mark's pulse hammered in his ears. He tried to move, tried to make his legs work, but it was as if they were frozen to the spot. He glanced back at the glowing symbol in the center of the room, and the sickening feeling in his stomach intensified. The faint glow was brighter now, pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. It was as though it was alive, breathing, moving, growing stronger with each passing second. The air around it crackled with a strange energy, like static electricity before a storm. Jake was the first to react, his voice strained with desperation. "What is this? What do you want from us?" The tall figure's head tilted slightly, as though the question was beneath him. "You are the offering," he said, his tone dark and final. "This is not for you to understand. You are here because you have been chosen."
Chosen. The word echoed in Mark's mind, and it made his stomach twist. They were the offering? What did that even mean? He felt sick, nauseous. The room seemed to close in around him, the walls pressing tighter, the air growing thicker. It was suffocating. The chanting began again, but this time it was different. It was louder, more forceful. The rhythm had changed, becoming faster, more insistent. It was like the words were being spoken by something other than the cult members, something ancient, something that had been waiting for a long time. Mark could feel the vibration of the chant in the very floor beneath his feet. His teeth rattled from the intensity, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood straight up. It was no longer just a sound. It was a force.
The tall figure stepped closer, and with every step, the air around them grew colder, the darkness deeper. Mark wanted to run, wanted to push past the figure and escape the basement. But the fear that had taken hold of him was paralyzing. His body refused to move. His mind screamed at him to act, to fight. But the dread that gripped him was stronger than anything he had ever felt. His body wasn't his own. He couldn't control it. Sarah, trembling, tried to take a step back. "We don't belong here. We were just exploring. Please, let us go." The figure's eyes, unseen beneath his hood, seemed to pierce through her. And for a moment, Mark thought he saw something. A flash of movement. A glimpse of something unnatural. The figure reached out a hand, slow and deliberate, and placed it on the stone symbol at the center of the room. His fingers lingered there for a moment before he spoke again. "Too late," he intoned, his voice heavy with finality. "The ritual has begun. You are no longer guests. You are part of the sacrifice." Sacrifice? The word hit Mark like a punch to the gut. They were the offering? They had walked into something far worse than they had ever anticipated. He felt a cold rush of panic wash over him, his mind racing to find an escape. But there was none. They were trapped, and whatever this ritual was, they were at its center. Suddenly, the floor beneath them seemed to shift. Mark's feet stumbled slightly, and he reached out instinctively for support. But there was nothing. The chanting, now deafening, seemed to reverberate from the very walls. The figure had lowered his head, his hands still raised toward the symbol, and the other cult members had joined him, their voices blending into one haunting chorus. Mark felt a sickening lurch in his stomach, like the ground was moving beneath him, twisting and warping. The air crackled with energy, the room vibrating with a force that made his teeth ache. He looked at Sarah and Jake and saw the same terror mirrored in their eyes. They had no idea what was happening, but they could all feel it. The growing darkness, the pressing weight of something ancient and evil that was now waking, stirred by their presence. He couldn't breathe. The pressure in the room was suffocating, the air thick with an unseen force that seemed to be pushing in on them from all sides. The chant grew louder, more frenzied. Mark couldn't understand the words, but he didn't need to. He could feel it in his bones, in his very soul. Something was rising, something that had been sleeping for centuries, waiting for the right moment. And they were the ones it had been waiting for. The moment the realization struck, it felt as though the room collapsed inward, as though the very foundation of the building was cracking beneath them. Mark could hear nothing but the chant, the thundering of his own heart in his chest. His limbs trembled as he stood frozen, unable to move, unable to look away from the growing darkness in the center of the room. The ritual was nearing its peak, and Mark, Sarah, and Jake had become part of it. The price of curiosity had been far greater than any of them could have imagined.
Time seemed to stretch infinitely. Every second dragged on, each moment feeling like an eternity. The chanting of the cult members had escalated, their voices no longer just low and rhythmic, but now faster, more frantic, merging into a cacophony of unholy sounds that reverberated through the air. It wasn't just a chant, it was a force, growing, building in power. It felt as though the very walls of the basement were pulsing in time with their words, closing in around them, sealing their fate, squeezing the air from their lungs. Mark, Sarah, and Jake were frozen, their bodies refusing to respond, no matter how much they willed them to move. The terror was too intense, too overwhelming. They were trapped.
Sarah's mouth opened, her eyes wide with panic, but no sound came out. She tried to scream, but the air around them was thick, almost as if the very darkness was swallowing her voice. Her lips trembled, her hands reaching out for Mark or Jake, but neither of them could offer comfort. They were just as frozen, just as terrified. It was as if something in the room had taken control of them, rendering them helpless, just another part of the ritual unfolding around them. They were prisoners of something far older, something far more powerful than anything they could have imagined.
Jake gasped for air, but it was like the very atmosphere in the room was turning toxic. Each breath felt like it was laced with poison, choking him from the inside. His chest heaved, but his lungs burned with every inhale. His eyes darted around the room, searching for any escape, but the walls seemed to close in on them. It was as though the room itself was alive, its energy constricting tighter and tighter around their bodies. Every part of him screamed to run, but his legs were numb, unresponsive. It was as though something was holding them in place, binding them to the spot. Mark, desperate for any way out, tried to move. His feet felt as though they were stuck to the floor, his body refusing to cooperate. He could feel the sweat trickling down his back, his hands clammy with fear, but he pushed against the force that was keeping him still. Stumbling backward, he crashed into something cold, its surface hard and unforgiving. For a moment, all he could do was focus on the chill that seeped into his bones from the contact. He turned quickly, hoping to find something, anything that could give him an escape. What he saw made his blood run cold. A tall, shadowy figure loomed behind him, its presence so overwhelming that it seemed to blot out the dim light from the candles. The figure was barely human, its shape tall and distorted, as if its form was constantly shifting in and out of reality. But the most terrifying thing about it were its eyes. They glowed like molten red coals, burning with an intensity that made Mark feel as though he were staring into the very depths of hell. There was nothing human in those eyes, only malice, only hunger, and it was looking right at him. Mark's heart hammered in his chest, his breath caught in his throat. He wanted to turn, to run, but his body refused to obey. The figure took a step forward, and Mark could feel the temperature in the room drop even further, as though the air had become thick with the chill of death itself. The ground beneath him seemed to tremble with each step the figure took, and Mark couldn't tear his eyes away. He was trapped in the gaze of something ancient, something evil. The figure's hand reached out, its fingers long and claw-like, and it placed them on the cold stone altar in front of them. The air seemed to crackle with energy as the figure began to chant louder than before, his voice rising above the chaos of the other cult members. The sound was no longer just a chant. It was a command, a summons, a call to something beyond the world they knew. As the figure's chant grew louder, the air around them seemed to shift, vibrating with a dark power. The walls of the basement felt as though they were pressing in, closing the three of them into a small, suffocating space. Mark could hear nothing but the sound of the chant, growing louder, more insistent, reverberating through his skull. He could feel it in his bones, the power in the words, the evil in the air. This wasn't just a ritual, it was a summoning, and they were the sacrifice. Mark's stomach turned as he realized the horror of it. They had come here, thinking they would see something weird, something spooky, something like the urban legends they had heard about. But this was no legend, it was real. And they had walked right into it. The cult members around them continued their chant, their bodies swaying in time with the words, their faces hidden beneath the hoods of their robes. They were not just participating in this ritual, they were the ones orchestrating it, and they had chosen Mark, Sarah, and Jake as their unwilling participants. Sarah, still unable to scream, could only watch in terror. Her eyes were wide with disbelief, her body trembling uncontrollably. Jake, gasping for breath, was shaking his head, trying to break free from the paralysis that had gripped them all. But it was too late. They had crossed the line. They were part of something that was far beyond their control, something that had been waiting for centuries. Mark's mind raced, trying to find a way out, a way to escape this nightmare. But it was impossible. The basement was like a cage, its walls closing in around them with every passing second. The figure with the red eyes took another step forward, his voice rising to a crescendo. The chanting became deafening, the sound filling every corner of the room, every crevice in their minds. The energy in the room was overwhelming, suffocating. It felt like the very air was alive with dark power.
twisting and warping everything in its path.
The ground beneath them shook violently, and Mark stumbled again, his legs buckling beneath him. He felt like the entire basement was coming apart at the seams, as though the ritual was tearing the world itself apart. The glowing symbol at the center of the room pulsed with an intense, blinding light, and Mark could feel the very ground beneath him tremble with its power. It wasn't just a symbol, it was a gateway, a portal to something far darker, something that had been waiting to break free. He tried to move again, but his body wouldn't respond. It was as though the ritual had claimed them, body and soul, binding them to this place. There was no escape. The air was thick with darkness, with the presence of something that didn't belong in this world. It was ancient, powerful, and it was awakening. And they were the ones who had disturbed it. The figure's chant reached its peak, and the room exploded with light. The walls seemed to collapse, the ceiling cracking above them, as if the building itself couldn't contain the power that was being unleashed. The cult members fell silent, their bodies stiff, their hands still raised toward the symbol. The light grew brighter, and Mark could feel the ground shaking beneath him, the very foundation of the building trembling as if it were about to be torn apart. And then, in that moment of blinding light, the world went dark. Mark's body went cold, his vision blanked out, and for a split second, he felt as though he was falling into nothingness. But then, the darkness was replaced by an unimaginable pressure, a weight that pressed down on them from all sides. Mark, Sarah, and Jake could feel something terrible, closing in around them. The ritual wasn't just happening anymore. It had already begun, and it was far worse than anything they could have imagined. The final chant from the cult reached an ear-piercing crescendo. It was as if the very foundation of the room itself was being ripped apart, as the words surged from the figures in unison. The sound reverberated in Mark's skull, pulsing through his entire body. The force behind it was so intense that it felt like the room was shaking under its weight. The walls trembling, the stone floor beneath them vibrating. Mark's chest tightened, his body unable to withstand the sheer pressure of the ritual. His heart raced, his mind screaming for release, for escape. They were trapped in something far beyond their comprehension. The figure with the molten red eyes stepped forward, and the air seemed to grow even colder, suffocating him in an icy grip. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move, his body locked in place by the overwhelming terror that surged through him. Sarah and Jake, equally paralyzed, stood beside him, their expressions filled with the same hopelessness. The chanting, louder now, seemed to be closing in around them. The very air charged with the energy of the ritual. Mark felt the heavy presence of something monstrous, something dark that was beginning to rise from the depths of the symbol. It was as though the world was on the verge of collapsing, about to open up into an abyss that no one could escape.
Mark closed his eyes, bracing for the inevitable. He couldn't move, couldn't fight back. There was nothing left to do. The figure with the red eyes was getting closer, its presence suffocating, and Mark knew in his gut that whatever was coming through the symbol wasn't just a creature. It was something ancient, something evil, something that had been waiting for centuries. Just as he felt himself being drawn into that darkness, the room suddenly erupted with a loud crash. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the basement, and for a brief, surreal moment, Mark thought his mind was playing tricks on him. He opened his eyes, but the room wasn't shaking anymore. The oppressive chanting had stopped, replaced by a sudden, piercing silence. The dim candlelight flickered, and then everything went completely dark. And then, in a flash, the door to the basement burst open. Light flooded the room, bright, blinding, and sudden. Mark felt the weight in his chest lift, as if the very air was rushing back to him. It was as if the entire basement had vanished, replaced by something else entirely. The oppressive darkness they had been trapped in seemed to melt away, replaced by an open sky, the cool night air rushing in. They were outside. For a moment, they just stood there, breathless, gasping for air, blinking in the unexpected light. Mark could hardly believe what had just happened. One moment, they were in that suffocating basement, trapped by the ritual. The next, they were outside, back in the alley where it all started. The world around them seemed so normal, so real, that Mark almost wondered if everything he had just experienced had been some sort of hallucination. The alley was still there. The same dimly lit street they had walked down earlier. The night was quiet, the sound of distant traffic faintly reaching their ears. The building where they had stumbled into the cult was gone, completely vanished. There was no sign of it, no trace of the basement, no sign of the ritual they had narrowly escaped from. It was as though the entire thing had never existed, wiped away by the flash of light that had pulled them out of it. Mark took a shaky breath, his hands trembling as he looked at Sarah and Jake. He couldn't believe it. They were alive. They had made it out. The terror, the chanting, the presence that had seemed so real, all of it was gone, replaced by the ordinary, peaceful silence of the alley. But as they stood there, catching their breath, a strange feeling settled over them. It wasn't relief. It wasn't safety. It was something else, something unsettling, something dark. Mark felt it first, a prickling sensation along the back of his neck, as though someone was watching them. He looked around, but the street was empty, the shadows stretching long across the pavement. He turned to Sarah and saw the same haunted look in her eyes.
She looked just as shaken as he felt, but there was something else there too. A sense of unease, of something wrong, something they couldn't quite put into words. She looked at Mark, her eyes wide with fear. "We're out," she said, her voice unsteady. "But what just happened? Where are we?" Jake, still trying to catch his breath, looked back at the empty space where the building had stood. He shook his head. "This doesn't make sense. We were just in there, right? It wasn't a dream. We didn't just—"
Mark nodded, his voice tight as he spoke.
"No, it was real. It wasn't a dream."
But the question that hung in the air, unspoken, was the one that gnawed at their minds. What had they escaped? They had been in that room, trapped in the ritual, at the mercy of the cult and whatever dark force they had summoned. And yet, they had been pulled out just in time, as if someone or something had intervened to save them. But who or what had done that, and why? As Mark looked down the alley, he noticed something else. The city around them seemed different. It wasn't the same as it had been before. The lights flickered erratically, casting long shadows across the street. The air felt colder, thicker, as if the very atmosphere had changed. It was like something was wrong with the world itself. And that feeling wasn't just in Mark's mind. He could see it in Sarah's face, in the way Jake kept glancing over his shoulder. They walked away from the alley, their footsteps echoing in the silent night. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was following them, something that had escaped the ritual when they did, something that had been unleashed. It didn't take long for them to realize they weren't truly free. As they walked further into the streets, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It wasn't just paranoia, it was real. There was a presence around them. Something that wasn't supposed to be in the world. They could feel it, like an itch beneath their skin, like eyes watching them from every shadow. Mark turned to Sarah and Jake, his voice trembling despite himself. Did that really happen? Was that real? Sarah didn't respond immediately. Her eyes were distant, staring straight ahead, but Mark could see the flicker of fear in them. "I don't know," she said quietly. "But it wasn't just a bad dream, Mark. Something came back with us." Jake nodded slowly, his face pale. "I don't think we're out of it yet." Mark could feel the weight of their words, the certainty in their voices. They hadn't just escaped the ritual. They had brought something back with them. Something dark, something that had been awakened by their presence. The feeling was in the air, thick and oppressive. It was following them, lurking just beyond their reach, waiting for the right moment to strike. They had thought they were free, but deep down, they all knew it wasn't over, not yet, and whatever had escaped with them was still out there, waiting.